Welcome to Critical Line Item. My name's Tom Ravlic. Thank you so much for joining me for this particular podcast. One of the things that we don't often talk about properly is how organisations need to create an environment for people in their workplace to feel safe and feel comfortable and to be able to do their work effectively. And we're seeing a few examples of, where change is occurring, whether it be in the private sector or public sector, uh, throughout the media. And the question keeps arising, at least in the back of my mind, if nothing else, at how people cope when change happens and what employers need to do. Well, I'm kind of lucky. I'm having a chat with someone who knows that stuff fairly intimately, and she's from Rehab Management. Renee Thornton is sort of going to take us through a bunch of things that employers need to worry about in terms of WorkSafe and the psychosocial elements of the workplace. And we'll touch on a few other bits and pieces that are linked to some of the stuff you might be seeing in the media. Renee, thank you so much for chatting with me today.
Thanks for having me on today, Tom.
Absolute pleasure. Now, before we get into some sector specific issues, I have a feeling that they're not going to be that different from one sector to another anyway. Uh, WorkSafe has issued some guidance nationally that has ramifications for employers in terms of how they set the environment up for people to feel comfortable with what they do. Can you give us a brief outline of what WorkSafe has done?
Yeah, yep. So, in terms of what's been sort of put into play, it's regulations around management of psychosocial hazards and injuries within the workplace. Now, in a nutshell, in its most simplistic sort of, if you really break down what it is, it's treating psychosocial or psychological hazards within the workplace in the same way that employers would treat a physical injury risk. It's asking employers to assess the risk or hazards in the workplace and risks in the workplace that might lead to an injury in the same way that we've historically always done it with relation to a physical injury. And there's probably two parts to that as to why they brought the regulations in, but historically we're more of a manual workforce, right? So it's really you've got lots of history around physical injuries and how we can prevent them and mitigate them and put in risk prevention strategies. Really what the regulations are asking for is to apply the same methodology to psychosocial hazards within the workplace.
Um, Psychosocial hazard, psychosocial is jargon for many people.
Lots.
How do we break? Yeah, well, psychosocial.
What's that mean?
I clutch my head and wonder. There's another word to remember. How do we break it down for people
Hmm.
when we talk about what we mean with
Yep.
psychosocial hazards? If we can go there.
So, psychosocial hazard is really any factor or situation that could arise in the workplace that could pose a risk to an employee's mental or emotional well-being. So, if you really, what does that mean? If you break that down, it could be like aspects of the job design, relationships that people have in the workplace. Maybe people aren't getting along, communication, leadership, workload, which is a really interesting one around psychosocial hazards, and overarching that is like the organizational culture. So um, i- in terms of a psychosocial hazard, it could be around stress, which or a stress-related event like bullying or harassment that occurs. Even ones that we might see, quite frequently in some sectors around occupational violence or exposure to traumatic events. If you think of police, fire and rescue, ambulance services.
Now, how do you actually manage that? Because
Mm,
one of the things that you see from time to time is cases where people who are investigators, for example,
mhm,
and they may be looking at material that is explicit on a frequent basis. They may be looking at uh, yeah, things related to material, what they call, I think, child sexual assault
Yep.
material. That
Yep.
sort of, yeah. Um, what are the sorts of strategies that people put in place when
Yep.
when there are jobs in which people are exposed to things? Because you know, unpleasant things are always
Mm, that's
going to
it.
be around. What do people do to manage that in
Yeah.
terms of strategy?
Yeah. So that example you gave there would be a really high risk scenario, right, where you've got somebody investigating traumatic events that have occurred, or looking at images that may have occurred. So in terms of how an employer could go about managing that, and I do know that many employers have been in this sort of sector, in that type of industry, would have been doing this for a number of years, most likely already, because they know they've got a high risk in that work environment. So if we use that example of someone that's exposed to traumatic events, maybe they're looking at images as that's part of their role. What an employer can do is really around that early intervention piece. So, okay, we know we've got a high risk with our workforce. They might look at, determining in the first instance if somebody is got the psychological function to be able to cope with that type of work environment. So they might be doing some screening to make sure that they're taking the right people in to that workforce in the first instance. And if you think of like police or fire and rescue, that's a typical thing that they would do prior to employment. So we've already understood, yep, we've got a high risk. Okay. So they would assess them potentially before going into that workforce. But then it's really about, okay, we know we've got a high risk here. What are we doing to make sure that we're identifying early if somebody is experiencing any trauma or stresses related to that role? So the employer might be doing sort of more frequent screening around somebody's psychological health and well-being. Um, an employer might also be looking at, okay, we've got high risk here. We can't actually mitigate the risk because we need somebody to do this job. Maybe there's another way. Maybe AI has come in and can sort that out for us, but I don't think we're there yet. So they might look at different strategies to reduce the risk to their workforce um, and put those in place.
Is it yeah, limiting the time of exposure, for example?
Correct.
Yeah,
Exactly.
how long do you spend in front of a screen looking at images that are by their nature traumatic?
Exactly. So, and it wouldn't be just one solution in this instance, Tom. So they might be looking at, okay, well, we've got this issue. How do we mitigate the risk? So it might be around, reducing time on that, completing that task, having more breaks. Also, making sure that there's an organizational culture that's supportive in place. So, what are they doing to support employee well-being within the workplace, as well as some employers might go as far as to offering other initiatives to support their employees around, making sure that they've got access to understanding what good sleep hygiene looks like, what good health looks like, other well-being opportunities for their employees as well. So it's not we're never going to be able to mitigate the risk or get rid of risk altogether. It's implicit in what we do every day, but it's what steps an employer can take once they've identified what that risk is to then reduce it and to support their workforce. Because at the end of the day, we, as an employer, we want people to be productive and healthy. And we know that if people are sort of healthy, they've got good handle on their well-being, they're going to be a more productive workforce as well.
If we can to uh, move to something that's a bit more contemporary. I mean, if you
Mm,
yeah, we've spoken about a job where there's a great uh, risk in terms of people getting traumatized and
hmm.
possibly jaded about the world. If all they're seeing is the emergency room side of life,
Yep.
um, but we're seeing examples now, and I think the consulting sector is going through it, where there is intense focus on it, and there's
Hmm.
um, negative headlines about an organisation every single day, not just, for example, PwC, but others. Um, what are strategies people can put in place to manage the stress levels uh, and the sort of help employees manage their own psychological well-being when
Mm.
the brand they work for is constantly getting belted? I mean, it can't be easy sitting in a workplace while that's happening.
I wouldn't think it is, but it's probably not just consulting industries. A lot of companies, will have negative media at some point in time. So, um, really, how does an employer manage that? I think it's around sort of acknowledging unusual times that are occurring and having sort of early warning signs in place around their workforce and how they're coping, how they're managing, but also really proactive conversations from a leadership perspective to be really open and transparent about what might be happening, whether it's in the media or what whatever the example is. But then identifying with that workforce, okay, we've got a high period of stress. What can we do as an employer to support our employees? So it might be around some additional wellbeing programs, might be around, if there's an event, debriefing and having very open conversations, using services, such as a psychologist to debrief. But they also might have consultation coming in around, okay, well, what can we do to support health and wellbeing when people are going through high workplace stress? And it's really, educating around the fundamentals of, taking good care of yourself, not just within the workplace, but also outside of work. As we know now, our day to day lives are often taken over by work.
Um, Speaking of that, before we touch on another sector that's of interest to me, being government, I mean, how important is a recent measure that's been raised in the media of allowing employees to disconnect, to be able to say, I don't need to be connected to work 24 hours a day on devices or whatever?
Hmm.
How critical is that?
I think it would be important for most people. I don't think we've gone as far as say France in terms of implementing it into legislation, but that disconnection from the workplace and to everybody's also going to be different as well. So that's one thing that we need to sort of factor into this around. Typically people talk about like work-life balance. Well, what does that mean? It means something very, very different, probably to me than it does to even you, Tom. So I do think disconnection is important. Um,
Yeah,
but also your type of role is gonna play into that as well. I think someone, media wise, you're constantly going to be on the go, waiting for that sort of next news story. That's part and parcel with the role as well, right?
just a little,
Yeah.
just a little, but there's also a need to take time out
Yep.
and where possible, sort of, vary the pace a little, or get out of the home office, so not staring at
Absolutely.
monitors all the time and
Yep.
that kind of thing. If we go from, just sort of the example that we've seen of the private sector entities that are copping a shellacking at the moment, and the strategies surrounding that, eh, are there any sort of specific characteristics when it comes to government, or is government much the same when you're looking at psychosocial risks?
Look, I think all sectors, government as well, but government probably most in particular, are probably have a lot of change constantly happening. Like we see change in government, state government, federal government, which does
Yeah,
cause a continuous cycle of change. And people can become a bit change fatigued as well. But also within those sectors, I think people also become resilient to change too, because they've seen it, once, twice, three or four times. So within the government sectors, I do think that, particularly from a federal space and our state government spaces as well, they do have a lot of focus on early intervention and prioritisation of probably leading the way in a federal space around early intervention for their employees. If they have an illness or there's some changes in productivity or something, or an injury, to really help support that employee to be able to perform their role. So I do think there's been some strong, strong programs in place for many, many years across the federal sector.
Has there been a change? I mean, I know that over the years people have spoken about the shifts in the nature of the arrangements that govern um, the public sector, that they've been to contracted opposed to the long-term tenure in some cases. Um, does that impact on the psychology of the way in which somebody does the work they do from what you've observed?
I probably wouldn't have enough knowledge in that space to really sort of talk about it. One of our psychologists probably could. I'm an occupational therapist by background, but I definitely think job stability and what that means to somebody can have a play in how you go about your job, and how safe you feel that employment is for you. So yeah, I wouldn't. It would definitely have a factor within that.
Well, obviously, there's information out there, Renee, for people that are either or running entities, or they're in charge of HR, or they're individuals themselves, trying to understand the optimal conditions for work. Where do they find material that might help them
Mm.
illuminate that?
Yep. So SafeWork's got some great material that they've released in terms of, how to best practice sort of manage psychosocial hazards around, health and well-being within the workplace, and also so do the each individual state regulators from a workers' compensation perspective. Some really good materials out there that employers can utilize that are readily available on the internet, and also some really good tools as well around how to assess psychosocial hazards or psychological well-being within the workplace as well. But I definitely encourage people to have a look at the Safe Work um, website.
I've been talking to Renee Thornton, who's with an organisation called Re- Rehab Management. Now, Renee, where do people find material on your organisation if they want to get in touch?
Yep. So they can visit our website. So it's rehabmanagement.com.au.
Okay, there we are. No, no, Renee, thank you so much for joining me for this particular chat, and I hope we can do this again at some point.
Thanks, Tom.